This is Ethan Erickson. This is the Long March of Liberty. So, today I'm going to be talking about render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. This, of course, comes from the Bible. I believe it comes from Mark 12:17, and this verse is important mainly because it's the verse often used to justify taxation. In the verse, it's referred to as tribute. Shall we pay tribute unto Caesar? Is the question that was asked. I actually believe the question was, is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar? And so the verse says something along the lines of, uh, Christ says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's. And so basically, the reason why the verse is important, I've already gone into. It's because people often use it to defend taxation, and that's the most common interpretation of the verse, I'd say. But I think it's actually notable that you could interpret this verse very differently. And it's actually not that difficult to come to a different interpretation. Because, you see, it says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and the question is, what is Caesar's? So, because if you can't identify that which is Caesar's, you don't genuinely know if it is. And so you wouldn't have to render something that which isn't Caesar's to Caesar, obviously, because not everything that someone claims is their own. So if I said, hey, that chair is mine, but, well, Tom just bought it, self-evidently isn't mine, then you don't have to render the chair unto me if I were Caesar, because it is not Caesar's. And so all the coins, they have Caesar's faces on them, which is pointed out by the verse. And so you might say, but because they have Caesar's face on them, which is pointed out, this means that they are Caesar's. And it's like, well, the coins are also made by Rome and circulated by Rome. But, and this is the important part, just because you made something doesn't actually mean it is yours. Like, I'll go back to the chair example. If I make a chair and I sell it to someone, well, I made the chair, and so for a time it was mine. But once I gave it to someone, I lose possession of it. It's no longer my property, it's someone else's property. So even, like, the idea that it is Caesar's because Caesar made it and put it into circulation, even that isn't correct because, well, self-evidently, it's like, if you've exchanged something for something else, you're revoking your ownership of one thing to gain ownership of something new. It's just a free exchange, how we all understand it. Except maybe the commies, they don't understand how trade works. Yes, I know I'm making a jab at commies for no reason. I can do a video on why Jesus wasn't a socialist as well, but I don't think that's really relevant at the moment. I'm talking about render unto Caesar and taxes. So, the interpretation, like the whole interpretation of this verse, rests on what is Caesar's. And so you can actually very easily argue that what you have doesn't genuinely belong to Caesar, and thus you do not have to render it unto him. You could it's like, I made it, and yes, I'm using the currency, but I exchanged my labor for the currency, and so through that exchange, the currency is no longer in the possession of, say, Caesar, and is now in my possession, and I have full ownership of it. And, like, that's why this verse, which often is interpreted as a justification and a biblical argument for the validity of taxation can actually be refuted, because it can easily mean if you have something that is genuinely Caesar's. I walk into the palace, I'm like, you know, he's got a lot of, like, ton and tons of pottery, a lot of it. And it's like, I'm just gonna take one. And so you walk out and you do what we commonly refer to as stealing. You have something of Caesar's now, it's not yours. Then the verse would say, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's," and so you must return to him the vase you have stolen. In a like funny way, you can actually just interpret this verse as "Thou shalt not steal," just being rephrased. But and one of the important things to know is, like, a lot of the time when the Pharisees and all the other people would come and question Christ, is they were trying to catch him, so that in, like, a sort of catch-22 situation, you answer one way and we'll get you, you answer the other way, we'll also get you. And he would leave the answer vague enough that like, it doesn't really, like, matter which interpretation you get out of it, because you can't get him on it, because it's like, oh well, this could be like, okay, I need to pay my taxes, my tribute back in the olden days, but it could also be don't pay taxes. And so it's actually very interesting, because you could come away with either option, and I genuinely, like, I can see both sides of it, but I tend to lean more towards the side which is the render unto Caesar only that which is genuinely Caesar's, which doesn't include all that which Caesar claims in the form of taxes. Because obviously Caesar hasn't engaged in any exchange with you in order to collect the taxes. He hasn't done any of the things which we would commonly do in a marketplace to gain ownership of something. He's just declared it so, but we all know that declaration of one's will to possess something is not the same thing as having genuine possession and ownership of a thing. And there's also the render unto God that which is God's, but that doesn't so much play too much of a role when it comes to interpreting the verse in favor or against taxation. But there are some funky arguments you could make that would also imply, like, this also wouldn't justify, like, taxation necessarily if you, with the render unto God thing, because it's like, well, what is God's? And the answer is, well, everything. And so, how can you render, and if you must render unto God everything, how can you then also render unto Caesar something? Because it would put you in this weird contradiction, unless you ought to render unto Caesar nothing. But that's a whole nother argument, which most of the debate, well, very little debate around render unto Caesar is about the first half, just the render unto Caesar. Normally the second half gets ignored, and I can see some reasons why or why not. But what people, I think, need to remember when thinking about, like, interpreting some of these scriptures is sometimes the one you're, like, taught doesn't necessarily have the best case for it, because it's like, okay, well, I was taught the interpretation X, but there's also, like, good argument for the other interpretation. And I think this is actually one of those verses which you can have some good debate over. Yeah, so that's basically my opinion on render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. This is Ethan Erickson. Vote for me, 2020, not 2020. Yeah, no. I'm not going to time travel back and start a campaign. No, 2040. This has welcome to the Long March of Liberty, and Civitas delenda est.